behalf of RIKK, the Institute of Gender Equality and Difference at the University of Iceland, I want to welcome you to this 8th lecture in the spring of 2023 in the lecture series on decolonization. Today's lecture is titled New Questions to Old Emotions, Celebrating Icelandic Independence in 2018. My name is Guðmundur Hálfdanarson. I'm a professor of history at the University of Iceland, and I will moderate this session. Today's lecturer is Ann-Sofie Gremaud, who is an associate professor of Danish at the University of Iceland. She holds a PhD from the University of Copenhagen, where she wrote, and her dissertation is called Kryptokoloniale landskapet, tíð, stig og rum í billeder af íslensk landskap, and deals with Iceland and pictures from Iceland. And she has published on contemporary Icelandic art and politics, on the crypto-colonial aspects of the Icelandic-Danish relation, and on emotional economies within the former Danish Empire. Among her recent publications was the two-volume work, Denmark and the New North Atlantic, Narratives and Memories in a Former Empire, which was published by Aarhus University Press in 2020, and she was one of the two editors of the volume, or the two volumes. Before I give the floor to our speaker, I would like to mention that after the presentation, we will have time for questions from the audience. And I will also say that there is a seminar here starting at 1 o'clock, so we must be out by then. So let's say we finish by 5 minutes to. Ann-Sofie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guðmundur. Thank you, all of you, for joining us here for the final RIKK lecture of this semester. I'm sure the next semester will be very interesting, too. I've been to some of the lectures, and it's looking good. Yeah, so as mentioned, my name is Ann-Sofie Gremaud, and today I brought with me some cases and some short examples from a text that I'm working on at the moment for a RIKK publication. And in my research, in general, I work with the long-term consequences and afterlife of the Danish Empire and its interpretations. And in my talk today, I'll focus on the relationship between Iceland and Denmark more specifically. And even more specifically on the Icelandic celebrations in the summer of 2018 of the Fyrirlesturinn, as it's called in Icelandic, the centenary of the Act of Union from 1918. This act declared Iceland to be a separate state under the Danish crown back in the day. And then later, of course, as you know, Iceland became a sovereign republic in 1944. So in my view, the celebration in 2018 came to raise questions about how independence struggle and nation-building narratives can develop in the aftermath of independence. And the examples that I have with me today show how the celebration was about the relationship with Denmark, but at the same time, more generally, about mechanisms of nation building and state formation. We'll take a closer look at a few examples from the official Icelandic program of the celebration, from the newspaper debate that sprouted from the program, and some examples of how different artworks engaged with the celebration. Here we are on a cool summer afternoon of the 18th of July, 2018, at Þingvellir. A group of Icelandic and foreign dignitaries are gathered for the official celebration of the centenary. In her capacity as the Speaker of the Danish Parliament, the Danish politician Pia Kjærsgaard has been invited to address the meeting. You can see her here giving her speech on this special day at this historic site. The ceremony was a symbolic reenactment and celebration of one of the most important examples of a stunde null or a 0 hour, a cut in Icelandic political history, the birth of a sovereign Icelandic state, and thus also a transformation of the relationship with Denmark. Inviting a representative from a former dominant party in this relation, the Danish parliament, can be seen as a gesture of peace and tolerance on the part of the Icelandic counterpart. The implicit message was clear: no hard feelings. As was stated on the website of the Danish parliament on the day of this commemoration, this is a story of how two countries in peace and mutual respect found a solution that met one country's desire to stand on its own, end of quote. But even though the relationship between Denmark and Iceland is calm and equal on the surface, debates can tense up quite quickly. Those of you who remember the handball gate not long ago, you know what I mean. It was intense. So for many years, Pia Kjærsgaard was the leader of the Danish People's Party, Dansk Folkeparti, and she's widely known for her efforts to limit immigration to Denmark. To protest Kjærsgaard's presence at this important day, a member of the Icelandic Social Democratic Party chose to leave the event during her speech, and 6 MPs from the Pirate Party chose not to attend at all. But initially, this controversy wasn't linked directly to the common history of Denmark and Iceland or interpreted in any post-colonial way, but that changed quickly. Because in the aftermath of the celebration, the Speaker of the Icelandic Parliament formally apologized for what had happened to Pia Kjærsgaard, but that didn't stop her from sharply criticizing the Icelandic politicians who had protested her presence. The tone of her comments caused the debate to continue, and in fact it gave it a whole new twist. The debate also became loaded with emotions that were projected back and forth in the debate. Kjærsgaard described the Icelandic political protesters at the Þingvellir event as being ill-mannered, or in Danish, uopdragne, which is a clear infantilization. She also stated that the Pirate Party in Iceland seemed to suffer from, quote, puberty problems, end of quote. Guðmundur Andri Thorsson, an Icelandic MP, then in turn accused Pia Kjærsgaard of acting as a stordane, an arrogant Dane, and thus he evoked a post-colonial discourse as a means of making sense of Pia Kjærsgaard's attitude. In her response, Pia Kjærsgaard then ended up concluding that, quote, some Icelanders clearly still have an inferiority complex, end of quote. During the debate, this cartoon from an Icelandic newspaper showed Pia Kjærsgaard in the place of the statue that you probably passed here in Reykjavik of the Danish King Christian IX. So the historical dimensions of this debate were clearly not lost on anyone. The political relationship to Denmark and the effective aftermath of the relation was only one aspect of this celebration. Equally interesting, I think, was the work that was done by people from the Icelandic art scene, the curators, artists, and galleries on scrutinizing the inner mechanisms that have made up the national project through its different phases. Through the artworks and exhibitions, it became a marking or a celebration of independence by taking a long, hard look at the complexity of that concept, the concept of independence. So here I will show you a few examples of how the nation-building process itself was singled out for critical scrutiny. More specifically, some elements that are at the very heart of the national project: the national flag, the independence movement, and the Icelandic current democracy. The exhibition Lífsblómið is my first case, and that is directly translated as a flower of life. It was the official exhibition of the centenary, a collaboration between the Árni Magnússon Institute of Icelandic Studies, the National Archive of Iceland, and Iceland's National Art Gallery. The English title blossoming, doesn't really capture the ambiguity of the Icelandic title, I think. Because this exhibition, in my opinion, was interesting because it was structured around a willingness to scrutinize national narratives. It was also structured around the fundamental assumption that nation states, as communities, as landscapes, and as democracies are fragile. And that is what is captured in the Icelandic title. This title, Lífsblómið, was inspired by the novel Independent People by Halldór Laxness. And as it said on the exhibition website at the time, the exhibition explores a deep yearning for independence. From the title to the curatorial structure, the exhibition encouraged a critical commemoration. Four main themes were picked out in the exhibition, and they were displayed as text on the walls and on the floor in the four different corners of the space. The first question was Iceland a Danish colony? The next question, who made the decision about sovereignty? Third question, possession of natural resources. And then the fourth, conflict over natural resources and cultural heritage. Together, these four themes outlined a framework that focused on power relations, internal and external, international and national, as well as a strong focus on internal conflicts, which I think is interesting for a centenary exhibition. The fragility of the nation-building project and its concrete historical challenges were a red thread throughout the exhibition. The tone was struck right when we came in, with a dramatic photo greeting the audience at the entrance, the one you can see here. It was taken during the days of the confrontations and demonstrations in downtown Reykjavik after the financial collapse in 2008, and it shows a teenage boy lying on the ground, his eyes fixed on the beholder, and he's handcuffed by the police. The photo was accompanied by a short article that was almost 100 years older from a local Icelandic newspaper from 1918, the year of the Act of Union. And this article that hung next to this picture highlighted the fragility of the newfound sovereignty, and it warned the readers against destructive processes in Icelandic society that could lead to its future downfall. From the outset, the exhibition approached the past and the present in a way that has a lot in common with three concepts that have been introduced by anthropologist and specialist on Caribbean history, David Scott. Some of you may know him already. His research centers on how we can keep post-colonial theory flexible and relevant in the changing historical circumstances. And I think that his concepts can shed light on what this exhibition actually did for the centenary celebration. In his analysis, he uses concepts mainly from literary studies. For example, he uses the typical genre structures such as the romance and the tragedy. The first concept I want to highlight from Scott's writings is what he calls the anti-colonial romance narrative. It builds upon a narrative of a past oppression, a present that is to be a moment of transition into a future vindication. So when Scott talks about a romance narrative, he refers to the literary genre of the romance, which often has this recognizable teleological structure. They, as Scott writes in his book, Conscripts of Modernity, the romance narratives, have largely depended upon a certain utopian horizon towards which the emancipatory history is imagined to be moving. I do not take this conceptual framework to be a mistake. However, I have a doubt about the continued critical salience of this narrative form and its underlying mythos, he writes. The Icelandic exhibition reflected a looking back at the past from a position on the other side of the romance narrative, a position where the nation state is a reality, but a complex and potentially fragile one. So this kind of a messy political reality after the romance has been fulfilled and the present looks a little bit more complex and unfolds as being perhaps more complex than expected, is the second aspect that Scott writes about in his book, Conscripts of Modernity. It is the literary and theatrical genre of the tragedy that Scott offers as a framework for understanding moments of radical change, such as changes following an independence struggle. As an alternative to a more teleological structure of the Romance narrative, he points to narratives that we know from the Greek tragedies, for example, the tragedies of Shakespeare as well, where the subjects find themselves in very tumultuous, paradoxical situations. And he uses this literary genre to make sense of the messy realities of political here and nows, rather than the present as understood as simply a transitory moment into a utopian future. As he writes, for tragedy, the relation between past, present, and future is never a romantic one in which history rides a triumphant and seamlessly progressive rhythm, but a broken series of paradoxes and reversals in which human action is ever open to unaccountable contingencies and luck. So here Scott is interested in the work that comes after a revolution or emancipation. Here one cannot use the futures that were made up in the past to be driving motors in an actual complex present. So, as mentioned, the exhibition, Livsblommet, seemed to grab a hold of that notion that many of the political contexts that Icelandic society has been in have more in common with the genre of the tragedy, a space where great forces collide and the nation-building project often faces crisis. In line with Scott's tragic understanding of a time after independence, the exhibition represented Iceland as a society that time and time again has been affected by crisis and the collision of historical forces, internal and external, if we can even make that distinction. This messy reality, as I called it before, the view that Scott calls tragic, is used to create a space of reflection within the exhibition. In the exhibition space, there were no ruptures between a sealed-away past before independence and a glorious present after independence. The past conflicts rather seem to seep into the present everywhere. This note was supported by the title and its reference to Halldór Laxness' novel from the mid-1930s about a struggling farmer, Bjartur og Guðbjartur Jónsson, and his all-consuming quest for an independent life. As a whole, the exhibition became a discussion rather than a celebration of values, ethics, and the multifaceted emotionality connected to the nation-building narrative. What the exhibition then showed us, the audience, was what we can call the problem space, the space in which we construct our fundamental questions and answers. And that space also then, secondly, itself was questioned. This is another one of David Scott's terms. He says, problem spaces alter historically because problems are not timeless and do not have everlasting shapes. Yes, we can hear the influence of this kind of Foucauldian epistemic thinking. And Scott urges us to be aware of the way the questions we pose to problems in our cultural context are tied up to a certain range of potential answers. Together, the questions and the answers make up what he calls the problem space, which in some way also limits our sense-making. Here he formulates it in an interview with, or in conversation actually, with Stuart Hall. This Discursive conjuncture, the problem space he's talking about, is defined by a complex of questions and answers, or better, a complex of statements, propositions, resolutions, and arguments offered in answer to largely implicit questions or problems. He points out that if the decolonial questions, like how can we become independent, are never renewed or reconceptualized, but rather kept on in a changing context, they block the problem space for other necessary questions. This is the work Scott is doing by rethinking and, if you will, refreshing post-colonial theory all the time. On the exhibition website, as mentioned before, it said that the exhibition explores a deep yearning for independence. The sum of the exhibition, the themes, the way they were executed, the connection between the title, the objects, and the themes, all of it became a way of stepping into the problem space of the independence movement and of the nation-building machinery and poking at the sore spots, all the assumptions, all the old questions, all the doubts, and not least the questions about responsibility. So, let's go outside again, back to the celebration at Þingvellir. So, seen from another perspective, up on the hill, more things were going on there. Aside from the politicians who boycotted Pia Kjærsgaard's speech, there was another more ambiguous demonstration or art performance going on at the same time. This is what you can see here. The performance was carried out by the two Icelandic curators, Guðni Guðmundsdóttir and Sara Öldóttir, and during the meeting they waved these two white versions of the Icelandic flag. It's an artwork made by the Icelandic artist Unnar Örn Auðarsson, and the work is called Opaque Shadow. It's from 2015. They also published an online statement that positioned Pia Kjærsgaard as a representative of an excluding and dangerous ethno-nationalist interpretation of nation building. So the performance itself was a part of the Cycle Music and Arts Festival, and that festival in 2018, it's a returning one, it's recurring, but that year it focused on the mechanisms of exclusion and border drawing as a part of nation building. Auðarsson's pale version of the Icelandic flag was described in the following way by these two curators. At the same time, the flags appear as national flags and peace flags and raise awareness of independence, national identities, conflict, warfare, and humanity. With this performance, we commemorate the victims of militant nationalism, xenophobia, and racism in the past and present, end of quote. In this way, the performance pointed to Pia Kjærsgaard's nationalist and anti-immigrant project as a potentially destructive general element of nation building, namely the mechanisms of exclusion and inclusion. But the performance and statement also addressed the other main theme of the centenary celebration, namely the relationship with Denmark. In the festival's online statement, they also placed the countries that used to be part of the Danish realm in a post-colonial present. That's the other quote. The heritage of colonial relations is linked to how these countries are, in somewhat different ways, carving out their place in the global context. End of quote. This question is another way to reach beyond the borders of Iceland and to put the Icelandic nation building in relation to other countries, to Denmark, but also to the other countries that were part of the Danish realm. Greenland became one of the countries that were at the center of the celebration in different ways. There were seminars and exhibitions focusing on the neighborship between Iceland and Greenland, and on historical examples of interactions, and they were used as a basis for conversations about the current interest in strengthening the ties within the Arctic. While the exhibition mentioned before, Livsblómið, primarily explored some of the difficult aspects of realizing the independence romance narrative, It actually also pointed to some of the prejudice that have characterized the Icelandic relationship to Greenland historically. And the other events that focused on Greenland took some of these reasons why interest in Greenland is relatively new here in Iceland as their point of departure. The Greenlandic authorities also took part in the celebration of the Icelandic centenary, because by initiative of the Greenlandic representation here in Iceland and the Icelandic representation in Greenland, they published this special edition of the Greenlandic paper Semitsjak, which is all about the centenary. The academic activities here at Háskóli Íslands also highlighted the fact that connections between Iceland and Greenland have been made difficult by the infrastructure of the Danish realm, the transportation routes, etc., but also by the inner racist logic of Eurocentrism in the centuries, where a position as being other than Western, European, white, was a vulnerable position. It's hard not to come across statements such as "Við erum ekki skrællingar," we are not Eskimos, when we go through historical sources here in Iceland. This Greenlandic paper, or Greenlandic Icelandic paper, on the other hand, kept its focus on the positive aspect of the present relation and on the almost utopian prospect of a future relation between Iceland and Greenland. One article by Greenlandic historian Jens Heinrich used the Icelandic centenary as a set-off to make the case for Greenlandic independence, being right around the corner. This is not the only time this has been done, of course. In his article, Jens Heinrich is, of course, positioned within a different problem space than the exhibition Livsblómið, namely within a Greenlandic problem space where questions are about the way towards independence. So in this way, he reintroduces the present Icelandic reality as a future made up in the past, to use Scotch phrasing. And he puts Iceland back in the romantic narrative, where the time after independence is not as important as the road towards it. In contrast to the way the exhibition Livsblómið presents the Icelandic nation's vulnerability, Heinrich's presentation of Iceland holds up the national project as the best one possible, and in principle as the only option in the future. Here then we could say that there are two different master narratives, of course, and two different problem spaces. The first one, of Livsblómið, is seen from a vantage point 100 years after Iceland gained independence, and the other one, the one of Jens Heinrich, is viewed from a point that is experienced as one point on the path towards a goal. I would say, however, that there is actually a bridge between these two positions, these two problem spaces, because the relationship with Greenland, as it's been presented time and time again by the Icelandic politicians, foreign ministry, in reports, and so on, Greenland becomes an important piece in the puzzle that makes up an image of the future of the Icelandic state. So in several political statements in recent years, a close relation to Greenland, preferably with Iceland in a leading position, can help secure Iceland's continued geopolitical value. So if we stay within Scots terminology, an alliance with Greenland, and in some cases also with the Faroe Islands, is an answer to the question, how can Iceland become a strong, even unavoidable player on the scene of Arctic region development and geopolitics? So, as the last example of how the centenary was celebrated here in Iceland, I want to show you an artwork that surprised a great many people here in the city. The Cycle Festival also collaborated with the Icelandic artist Steinunn Gunnlaugsdóttir, who created a sculpture for Reykjavik's urban space on the occasion of the centenary. This meant that people who were walking around Lake Tjörnin in the middle of the city could suddenly see an approximately 2 meters tall pink sausage that posed on a light yellow bread roll in the middle of the water. The sausage indeed looks like a human figure, or perhaps a mermaid, as it sat there with its tail-shaped knot. Gunnlaugsdóttir's sculpture was indeed called the Little Mare Sausage, and I think it can be seen as a multifaceted thematization of both current aspects of nation building and the relationship to Denmark. The sculpture raised questions about the ways that the afterlife of the Icelandic-Danish connection is treated in art and popular culture through its reference to sausages and hot dogs as well-known Icelandic symbols of low culture and the everyday. Through the references to the Little Mermaid, the sausage can also be said to be a symbol of Danishness, Danish cultural influence in Iceland. Just as it has been the case with the Little Mare Sausage relative in Copenhagen, the Little Mermaid, this sculpture has even had to endure decapitation and other kinds of vandalism before it was finally removed. The sausage sculpture, however, appears to be more apolitical than it actually is, I think. In its peculiar combination of mermaid and hot dog, it draws the Danish-Icelandic relationship into the most everyday and Icelandic in quotation marks. In this way, it contains a duality in relation to its cultural context. Modern Icelandic society, where it becomes a ridicule of the everyday banal nationalism and a reference to the continuing and complex cultural connections to another sausage-eating nation, namely Denmark. The sculpture has kind of a silly harmlessness about it, which caused many people to react with giggles and smiles when they met it, while others were very provoked by what they thought was an ugly and out-of-place figure, and they referred primarily to the respectable location that it got next to the town hall. In his theory of cultural intimacy, anthropologist Michael Hertzfeld states that any participation in the discussion of the nation is at the same time an invocation of it, regardless of whether it's a criticism, a ridicule, or something else. As the Mare Sausage was part of the ongoing art performance project, Democracy is a Hot Dog, it also became a part of a critique of the political development that followed Icelandic independence. Democracy is a Hot Dog is an art project that is a series of critical performances and videos in which the Icelandic political system is compared to a hot dog stand. At this hot dog stand, the customer's only choice is a hot dog. So it comes to state that all Icelandic political parties basically make up the same meal. But the Little Mare Sausage itself and the entire Democracy is a Hot Dog project, together with the Livsblómið exhibition, all of them examine the national independence as a liberating strategy for populations, both in Iceland and elsewhere in the world. All of them relate to one of the fundamental questions that David Scott poses with a reference to Hannah Arendt, actually. He asks, how can societies that struggle towards independence succeed in creating institutions that secure not only independence, but the continued freedom for the whole of the population? So both of them, Arendt and Scott, distinguish very deliberately between independence and continued freedom secured by the state. So the present as it looked in the Romance narrative as a utopian future, and the messy present of the tragic narrative can never be the same. So, to conclude, as we have heard in his theory about independence struggles, David Scott points to the importance of looking critically at both fundamental political answers of our time and the questions that lie implicitly underneath them. As a part of the hot dog project, the Mayor Sausage seems to express that in the current political context, all answers are the same, and the people, the population, are not urged or even allowed to change the questions. In this way, the apparently harmless and silly Mayor Sausage becomes a physical symbol in the middle of the Icelandic reality here in Reykjavik that addressed at least two underlying themes in modern Icelandic state formation. Firstly, the way that the Danish connection is remembered and handled, and secondly, a critical stance on what came after, namely the current Icelandic democracy. Just like the official exhibition, Lífsblómið, and the flag performance, this strange pink guest who appeared in the lake posed fundamental questions about the nation-building narrative that have been central for many years. Both the exhibition and the sculpture are ways of formulating a call to move away from the questions of the independence movement, such as when and how can we become a free nation, to new questions like who are we going to be free from, and how are we going to secure that freedom in a sustainable way? And not least, in the spirit of David Scott, who gets to pose the fundamental new questions that drive our society forward? Thank you.